A Tale of Bread and Thread. A story by Maxine Rose Schur and illustrations by Christina Deliso. And read by Mr. C, the teacher. This is a tale of bread and thread, made up from crumbs and stitches, how a penniless baker along with his wife go from rags to riches. When the world was full of wonders, there lived a poor baker named Mr. Bumble Crumb. He was poor because he was the very worst baker in the world. His cupcakes were heavy as doorknobs, and his cookies brittle and broken as beach shells. Mr. Bumble Crumb daydreamed so much he could not pay attention to his baking. Once, while daydreaming, he hadn't noticed an alarm clock had fallen into the dough, and the next morning was awakened by a loaf of rye bread. And what about his wife? Mrs. Bumble Crumb was a sensible woman. Could she not have made a little money sewing for the villagers? No. The baker's wife was the very worst seamstress in the world. Once the poor woman sewed Mr. Grump's coat to Widow Crank's shawl, and since neither customer could agree where to separate the garment, they decided to marry and share the darn thing. Now, one late afternoon, just a day before the midsummer festival, the baker and his wife were sitting inside their tiny cottage. The cottage was hot from the ancient oven. As Mrs. Bumble Crumb was fanning herself with a slice of stale poppy seed bread, she remarked, "If only we had a nicer home, with a white painted porch where we might sit out in the cool breath of a summer's eve." "Aye," replied the baker, "it would be a lovely thing indeed, for it is a trial, living as close as moles, yet it is not for us to want what we cannot have." His wife sighed. "You're right, my dear." Suddenly, there came a loud knocking at the door. When the baker opened it, they saw a richly dressed man reading from an important-looking scroll. "Hear ye, hear ye! Be it known that His Royal Majesty King Sniffins will visit the village tomorrow for the Midsummer Festival. He hereby orders the baker of the village, Mr. Bumble Crumb, to bake a bread for His Majesty's banquet table. It must be a most special bread, fit for a king." "Crumbly crust," the baker gasped. "Silence, I haven't finished," the messenger snapped. "Be it known that the seamstress of this village, Mrs. Bumble Crumb, is ordered by King Sniffins to sew a handkerchief as exceptionally beautiful by which the king will remember the midsummer festival." "Sizzling scissors!" Mrs. Bumble Crumb exclaimed. After the messenger rode away, the baker vowed he would make the best bread in the whole world, a bread fit for a king. The baker's wife vowed she would sew the most beautiful handkerchief the world has ever seen, fit for a king. They went right to work. The baker measured the flour and sugar many times to make sure he was measuring right. But after a while, he began to daydream. When he glanced out the window and saw summer dressed in all its finery, he exclaimed, "Right here on earth, red roses, bluebells, and lavender make a rainbow." The baker looked longingly at the beauty of the world. He watched the fuzzy bumblebees probing the primroses, then spied a yellow butterfly playing peekaboo among the pansies. Mr. Bumble Crumb was so enchanted by the pretty scene, he lost track of time and forgot his measuring. He forgot how much yeast he had already added to the dough, so he added more. And then, just to make sure, he added more. And then more. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bumblecrumb was busy sewing the king's handkerchief. She was careful with her stitches, counting each one as she worked. But after a while she began to think about the bread her husband was baking. "I hope he adds a wee bit of clover honey," she thought. "Nothing beats clover honey to give a pleasing taste." And then she wondered if perhaps he should add a smidgen of ginger, or a pinch of pepper, and perhaps crunchy walnuts or plump raisins. The more Mrs. Bumblecrumb thought about her husband's bread, the more she thought how he could make it even tastier. The more she thought, the more she sewed, and sewed, and sewed. Late that night they went to bed, happy that their work was done. The next morning the baker popped the bread of dough into the oven, and not long after he heard a loud knocking. Again it was the king's herald. "Hear ye, hear ye!" he shouted. "King Sniffins is arriving at the village square in 1 hour. Prepare to present your gifts to his majesty." While Mrs. Bumblecrumb went to wrap the handkerchief, Mr. Bumblecrumb went to check on his bread. But when he opened the oven, a huge yellow blob burst toward him. Terrified, the baker tried to push it back, but the blob swelled larger and surged forward with a terrible roar. "Help me!" he shouted to his wife. She ran to his aid, but even pushing together, they were still not strong enough to shove the thing back. They ran from the house with the giant blob following behind. The blob wobbled through the summer streets, lurching toward the village square, sticking and smacking and stretching bigger and bigger and bigger as it went. When it grew to the size of a small house, it began to torment the villagers. "Burple, hubble, bloop," it burped in Lady Snocket's face. "Huzzle, fazzle, sniss," it hissed at Farmer Fife. "Glipple, popple, slurp," it spat at Butcher Good. As it slobbered over gardens and hedges, the terrified villagers ran in all directions, scattering like chickens before the hideous thing. The baker stood horrified as he realized that too much yeast had turned the king's bread into a monster. Then a wonderful thing happened. The blob moved slower and took on the rich color of a copper penny, then finally stood still. The hot midsummer sun had thoroughly baked the dough. Now a delicious smell of fresh baked bread floated over the village. The royal trumpets were blown, and brave King Sniffins rode right up to the tame, sweet-scented bread. "Thunderous thrones!" the king roared. "A bread as big as a house! Wonderful surprise!" King Sniffins began to laugh, and soon everyone was laughing. The villagers laughed so hard that soon they all had to blow their noses, and this reminded the king of something important. "Where's my royal handkerchief?" King Sniffins demanded. Mrs. Bumblecrumb stepped forward. "I have it here, your royal person." She curtsied low as she handed the handkerchief to the king. But the king and the villagers began laughing all over again, for when the king unfolded it, they saw the handkerchief was as big as a blanket. "Thumbs and thimbles!" the baker's wife cried. "I must have counted wrongly." "Never mind," the king chuckled. "It will make a perfect horse blanket. Merry midsummer!" At the festival, the king bade everyone to enjoy a good slab of Mr. Bumblecrumb's bread. Yes, at the midsummer festival, everyone, whether rough or royal, had a grand time. Now you might suppose that Mr. and Mrs. Bumblecrum went to bed happy. But they did not. That evening they heard a commotion outside their home. Stepping outside, the couple saw a crowd of villagers holding signs and chanting. "For our sake, do not bake. We may ache with your cake, but we'll be dead with your bread. With too much yeast, you have made a beast." The message was clear. The villagers had been so frightened by the enormous runaway bread, they were now demanding that the baker stop baking. Forever. That night, Mr. Bumblecrum tossed unhappily in his sleep. What would he do without his bakery? How would he make a living? How would they live now? The next morning, he awoke to a marvelous smell. He followed the smell to the kitchen to find his wife standing proudly in front of little bread loaves nestled in a basket, warm and brown as puppies. The counter was lined with pies still steaming from the oven. They scented the air with the fragrance of a summer orchard. The baker knew that from that day on, his wife would do the baking, and he figured there was nothing for him but to take up sewing. He soon learned to love the firm push and pull of a needle and became the best tailor in the kingdom. In time, Mr. and Mrs. Bumblecrum bought a new home with a white painted porch. Someone once told me that when King Sniffins married, it was Mr. Bumblecrum who sewed the royal wedding clothes, and it was Mrs. Bumblecrum who baked the wedding cake. Yes, the world was full of wonders, and perhaps it still is. This story wasn't meant to teach, to give a moral, or to preach, but there's a secret, and it's true. It's one I want to tell, just you. Beneath your thoughts and in your heart lie secret talents and hidden art. Try your hand at something new. Discover things that you can do. They're hiding right inside of you, things you never knew you knew.